And welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller. And today we have a special guest on a special day here, Professor Kaitlin Raimi from the University of Michigan's Ford School. And Kaitlin studies public perceptions of climate change and climate solutions and behaviors and all these kinds of things, and has done a lot of research. We're going to go through various things that she's worked on. But to start off, Kaitlin, first of all, welcome, and maybe you could give us just a bit of your background and tell us about the areas that you research.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a social psychologist by training. I have a PhD in social psychology. But what I'm mostly interested in studying is how people think about climate change. So, how people think about the science of climate change, how they think about policies related to climate change, how they think about their own behaviors in relation to technology and policies, and how to motivate people to take action and take effective action on climate change. I have some related work that's not necessarily climate related, but happy to chat about if we come to that, on people's belief superiority. So people thinking their own opinions are more objectively correct than everybody else's. Turns out that's not great for your social life, among other things. But most of what I study is climate change in particular.
And you're not a climate scientist, right?
No.
But tell us a little bit about your background. What did you
Yeah,
do?
so I was a psych major as an undergrad. I briefly thought about clinical psychology and then decided that wasn't for me. I was really interested in the research side. A lot of social psychologists, when they apply their work, end up going and doing marketing kind of jobs. And I was really interested in the persuasion and things like that, but wanted to use it for good. So thought that climate change was like a key issue where clearly human behavior was part of the problem, and so psychology could be part of the solution. And so I pursued a PhD in social psychology. I was the only, there's not a lot of social psychology programs where you can specialize in climate change, so I had to kind of fill in the gaps. So I spent 5 years getting a social psychology PhD where I was trying to grasp at the climate side wherever I could. And then I ended up doing a postdoc at Vanderbilt's Energy and Environment Institute. So I went from being the only person in a psych department who cared about climate change, at least professionally, to being the only psychologist in an Energy and Environment Institute and working with lawyers and physicists and sociologists, getting like thrown in the deep end on interdisciplinary research. And then I was studying a lot of policy related outcomes. And so when a job popped up at the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy, I ended up being a good fit for that. So I never would have guessed I'd be in a policy school, but it's a great place that I can do interdisciplinary work. And yeah, that's how I ended
That's
up here.
great. Well, because on Climate Chat, we interview lots of folks who study climate science and climate solutions. And as I've always been saying, we kind of know all the science we need to know. We kind of know all the solutions we need to know. But what we don't know enough about is human behavior and why we're failing to act. And so we're going to try to get into some of that today. Let me note to everyone that there are links to Kaitlin's home page in the description, as well as links to all of the research that we're about to go through. So if you look in the video description, you can get links to all of that. And why don't we actually just jump right in? Let's see if we can do this way. So this is one of the papers that you wrote, how to encourage pro-environmental behaviors without crowding out public support for climate policies. So why don't you just tell us what is this about, and what can we learn from it?
Yeah. So this was a response. So whenever psychologists talk about, or anyone talks about individual actions on climate change, like what people, the lay public, can do on climate change, a really fast kind of critique that you hear is that, like, oh, the public actually can't do anything, and we should stop trying to encourage this individual behavior. This is a distraction from the big societal level changes that need to happen, and this is counterproductive. This is just going to crowd out support. And I understand where that is coming from. But the research suggests that talking to the public about individual actions on climate change can, under certain situations, make them less supportive of the big picture policies that we need. So there is some truth to this. If you say, like, here's this behavior-based program, that might undermine people's support for climate policies that are broader, like a carbon tax. But really importantly, this only happens when people are misled to think that this is going to be the whole solution. So people are not very good at knowing which behaviors matter or which proposals matter, and so they want to fix everything with one action. It's like we want it to be clean and easy. And so we're gonna, if something seems easier, we're gonna say, great, this will take care of it. But if you accurately convey to people, like, the magnitude of what you can do as an individual is much less than what a carbon tax or something like that could take care of, then people get it and they still support those policies. And so what this paper was trying to do is trying to lay out, if you are going to do individual level campaigns, or if you are going to try and get people to change their behaviors, which I think we should do, how can we do this in a way that doesn't undermine support for the broader societal level policies that we absolutely need in addition to any individual action? And so in this paper, I laid out kind of 4 general guidelines. I called it the SESH model, which is kind of a silly acronym. But basically what I argue is that we should focus on, that if you're trying to promote these individual actions, you should focus on specific high impact behaviors, is the first guideline. That's because people, like I said, are not good at knowing which behaviors matter. They tend to do a lot of things that are actually not that effective. So if you ask people which behaviors matter the most for climate change, they'll include things that are totally unrelated, like littering, or they'll include
recycling.
Or they'll include a lot of like turning off the lights kind of stuff, which like helps, but is not nearly as effective as like installing a heat pump or, other kind of high-end efficiency behaviors, like installing more efficient equipment kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to have people take individual action, you need to help them understand which behaviors actually matter. And that's a matter of knowing which behaviors matter and which behaviors people will actually do, because that's equally as important. There are some behaviors that are really high impact, but you can't get people to do. So carpooling is one example of something that would have a big impact if people would do it, but people just won't do it by and large. So picking your battles as a kind of persuader is important. And then the second insight is that you have to communicate the efficiency or the efficacy of these behaviors, so that people don't think that these individual actions are going to be just as effective as the broad level policies. You need to say, like, here's what this could realistically do, and this is how this compares to, the IRA or or something like that, so that people understand the magnitude of these interventions. You also want to focus, it turns out, on behaviors that are similar to key policies. So if you know that there is a policy you want people to support, it turns out it's helpful to promote individual actions that people see as related. So if the action is some sort of big subsidy for things like heat pumps, then talking about heat pumps is helpful. If you're trying to talk about the policy that's being debated at the time is a carbon tax, then heat pumps, you'd have to maybe translate that for people to tell them how that's related, because you see positive spillover from things that people see as similar behaviors. And then the last thing I say is you have to show people how it serves the same higher order goals. So this is going towards climate change, or this is going towards your higher order goal of being a good citizen or a responsible consumer, or whatever it is that you think might resonate with people.
So it's been said that British Petroleum came up with the idea, the concept of the personal carbon footprint in order to shift the blame of climate change from them to you.
Yeah.
And I think it's been pretty effective. How does that thing going on there interact with the research that you're doing?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't study, fossil fuel industry propaganda, but I certainly.
Well, they're
see,
saying
like,
individual action is
Yeah.
is the solution when that rather than regulating us. I mean, that's what they're saying, right?
Right, absolutely. And that is where a lot of the pushback on individual action comes from, is like understanding that that is the kind of driving force for a lot of those campaigns. So I totally understand that. I think that we still have a public who is concerned about climate change increasingly and want to do something about it and are grasping at straws, sometimes literally at straws. And so I think they're going to use the footprint calculators or whatever else that are out there, some of which are more helpful than others, and having guidance for what they should do with that energy and concern is going to be helpful regardless of where that initial instinct is coming from. And that I include public action as a major effective action that people can take. So it's not just what you can do in your private life, but what you can do to, change policies as well.
I'm sorry, I'm actually having trouble with my audio here for a second.
Okay,
I'm trying to get this going here. I might have to switch to my AirPods for a second. So sorry about that. This is a little something I think with research. Okay, say something now. Can I hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Okay, now, yeah, that makes it work. Okay, I don't know why. Shouldn't do that, but that's the way it is. So let's move on to this next one. I have to first switch. Let's see, replace with screen share and this one. So meta-analysis of pro-environmental behavior spillover. Well, maybe you can just tell us what this even means.
Yes, right. It's I'm getting a little bit of audio feedback.
Okay, I'm going to try to get back to my 1 second. Okay, it does say that. Testing 1, testing 2. Are you still getting feedback?
I am. Nope, that sounded okay on my end.
Okay, let's try.
Okay, so this paper, the title doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. So meta-analysis is just a statistical tool to say, like, of all the papers that have been done in this topic, if we combine statistically all of their effects, what is the overall answer that we're seeing? It's a way of saying, like, there's a lot of papers being done on this particular topic, and what do they say on net? Because pro-environmental spillover is this question of, if you get people to do one pro-environmental action, what does that mean for their likelihood of doing subsequent actions? So if I successfully get you to recycle, what does that mean for your likelihood of going out the next day and buying a heat pump, or your likelihood of going out and eating a meat-free meal the next day? And so there's a lot of research that's been done in this area. Some of it finds evidence for what's called negative spillover. So getting people to do one pro-environmental action makes them less likely to do the next action, maybe because they feel like they've done their good deed and they're off the hook, and they have this like moral license to be naughty, or because they feel like they've taken the single action and they did it because they felt bad and they don't want to do it more. But there's also evidence for positive spillover. So getting people to engage in that first behavior makes them more likely to engage in subsequent behaviors, maybe because they now think of, like, oh, I did this environmental deed, I feel like I'm an environmentalist more, or something like that. And so we did this meta-analysis to see, like, on net, what are we finding here? And what we found was that these effects are really small on average. So they're really close to zero. We sometimes see some positive spillover effects, sometimes see some negative spillover effects. But I think the main takeaway is that there's a lot of hand wringing over the idea that any intervention is going to affect subsequent action. And while it's worth testing those, I'm not sure that it deserves as much of the attention as it's been getting, because it seems like these effects are very small. Where we did find effects, it was almost like no effect on intentions for future behaviors, a tiny negative effect for slightly less likely to do future behaviors, and no effect on policy support. So that question of, like, the individual versus the big picture, we really, and you can see in the abstract that's on the screen, it's negative 0.01 effect size.
That's funny because I've heard that, you know, the reason we should, since they really have no impact on emissions compared to policy, I mean, a millionth of it or whatever, that the whole idea behind it is get someone doing something positive and then they'll be more engaged to support policies. You're saying, well, it's not really true.
Yeah, but it's also not true that it will make them less engaged. So
Okay.
it's like, I think like if what you want is to get people engaged in policies, then you should target policies, or you should target policy support directly. And that is really important to do. We need people to be pushing for policy support. But I don't think like first targeting other individual actions is the way to get there, because it just doesn't seem like there's a big connection between those.
And how about the rebound effect? So I go recycle my garbage for a year, and I go, I don't know, I buy an EV, and I say, hey, I did all this great environmental stuff. Let's take a trip to Hawaii. You know, did you look at that at all? Whether there's, you know, rebound?
Yep. So that's what we call that negative spillover in psychology, but
Okay.
it's the same idea as the rebound effect. So the rebound effect in economics is specifically about the money you're saving. The kind of reasoning that you're talking about would be called moral licensing. Like did my good deed, and now I can go do something bad with it. And that's that negative spillover, and that we're finding a very small effect of negative spillover. That's that negative 0.03 that you see in the abstract there. But really very small on average. So, and there's like
you're not measuring in terms of carbon, are you? You're measuring in terms of like
behavior.
Behavior.
Yeah.
So one trip to Hawaii equals like, you know, 1,000 years of recycling your garbage or
Right.
whatever.
Right. But we find
I don't know
that
what the
like,
number is, but
yeah, the difficulty of the behavior, which is often tied to not always, but often tied to the carbon impact, doesn't seem to matter. So we thought that it might make a difference if it's starting with like a big, thing that costs a lot or that's really difficult to do. And it turns out that doesn't make a big difference.
Okay. Okay. So, see what I had. Well, we talked about that. So let's this next one is really interesting. Give me a second to make the switch. Share this screen. Here we go. The aversion to tampering with nature scale. The aversion to tampering with nature scale. Individual differences in discomfort and altering the natural world. This is really interesting. Tell us about this study.
Yeah. So this is. I feel like I should back up and tell you a little bit of the history that came up to this study first. So I have some work on people's perception of climate technology, so things like carbon removal. And one of the things that it turns out is really important for predicting whether people support or oppose these technologies and a range of other technologies is whether people think that these are natural approaches. So the more natural they think an approach is, the more they tend to like that technology. And that's not just my work, that's a lot of other people have found similar effects. So people in general really prefer natural things, even if the outcome is completely the same, they will prefer a natural seeming medication than one that seems synthetic, or a natural, if it's a disaster that was human caused versus natural, they think it's worse if it was human caused. So this research goes back decades. But what we were interested in was whether there was all the work up to this point was focused on people's perception of the technologies. So it's very like, what is any given technology being perceived as in terms of its naturalness? And what we were curious about was, well, what about the people doing the perceiving? Are there some people who are more or less comfortable with the idea of humans tampering with the natural world or altering natural processes? And so that's what we set out to test with this measure. And so it's a really short scale. You can, if you find the paper on the link, you can take it yourself and see where you fall. But it just asks people like how much humans should be involved in altering the natural world, how comfortable you are with that. And it turns out that your answers to those 5 questions predict support or opposition to a wide range of technologies. So it predicts support at least technologies that people see as tampering with the natural world. So things like geoengineering, but also GMOs and pesticides and cloning or gene therapy or nanoparticles. Other researchers have used it to predict support for renewable technologies or lab-grown meat, or really anything you can think of where like humans are intervening in natural processes. This scale seems to predict. And real behavior as well, like donating to anti-tampering causes.
So what I find really interesting is you're studying these things as you mentioned, geoengineering, GMO, pesticides, cloning, gene therapy, and nanoparticles. And these are essentially nothing on the scale of burning fossil fuels and increasing CO2 content of the atmosphere by 50% by emitting 2.6 trillion tons of CO2, plus other greenhouse gases and other land use impacts. So there's like literally changing the livability of the earth in a existential manner. And then there's everything else here. And yet our brains focus on GMO as being the important thing to worry about, when it's, I don't even know how many orders of magnitude difference there is. It's a million to a billion times difference. I'm not sure what, it's something on that order. And why, so that's what I want to talk to you about. Why is it that the big thing that is in front of our face and we do every day, and almost every human is participating in, is totally ignored as tampering with nature, when it's the tampering with nature and everything else is sort of a sideshow?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I wouldn't say it's totally being ignored. We find that the same scale predicts people's concern about the environment and concern about climate change. So it's not that people are ignoring that, like in people who are concerned about this issue. I think what drew me to this was the kind of sometimes odds I see like within the environmental movement of people who are really concerned about climate change, but are also really opposed to some of the technologies that are being proposed to address it. And so this kind of conundrum of like what's going on there, I think this might be at the heart of some of that. It's that the same people, if you are concerned about human interference with nature, then you're going to be super concerned about climate change. That's a major interference with nature. But you also might be afraid of other approaches that you see as like more human intervention with the natural world, and maybe being like adding on different potential side effects or things like that. And so I think that very kind of thing that is frustrating you with that understanding is exactly what drove me to this, is trying to understand like psychologically what is causing this interplay. And we see this a lot with like not like within environmental movements, often fighting for things that seem more natural on the surface, and trying to protect that, whether or not it's the most effective approach. And
okay, go ahead.
The other thing I'll note is that, I mean, other scholars have written about, like with carbon removal, a lot of the quote unquote naturalness of these approaches is really very arbitrary and subjective, and like different framing can make it seem more or less natural. So a lot of it is sometimes about communication rather than something inherent to the technology.
It reminds me of the phrase, people care far more about how they die than if they die. There are certain kinds of things they worry about, like they don't want to die in an airplane crash, which the chances of that happening are almost nothing compared to driving your car or smoking a cigarette or something. But I'm still want to go a little bit farther. Why did you not include burning fossil fuels as tampering with nature in your study? Like, why was that not one of the there's a very small list, so why isn't the biggest thing also one of the things that you studied and asked people about?
I think because we were focused on technologies that might be seen as new and emerging. And so we weren't asking about fossil fuels because those have been around. There is some recent work that suggests that the more familiar a technology is, the more it's seen as natural. So it may be that it would be interesting to study. We did not include it here because we were focused on things that were, two reasons. One is that we were focused on things that seemed like more emerging technologies. Second reason is that we were trying for things that wouldn't be totally swamped by political ideology. And we just didn't think we'd have enough variation politically on the fossil. We thought that would get like people's political ideology would kind of eat up all the variance in our measures, and we wouldn't have room for other psychological variables there. So that's like part of the pragmatic reason. But I do think that it people's aversion to tampering with nature would affect their views on fossil fuels as well. So I totally take that point.
Well, I think we're going to get back to that when we talk about geoengineering, because people are really focused on the dangers of geoengineering without focusing on the dangers of not doing geoengineering. Because I think you said something very important. If we've been doing it a long time, then we kind of think of it as natural, and we think that increasing CO2 content in the atmosphere by 50% is like somehow natural, when it's the most unnatural thing there ever was, practically. And yet our brains are adapted to it, and this is very dangerous, actually. So I don't know. But we'll get back to that a little bit more. Let's see. I first have to look up the next one, brief superiority. I have to bring that one up. Belief superiority. Okay, and then we can switch to it. Okay, replace. Sorry, it takes a few moments to do this here. So the next paper we'll talk about is belief superiority in the environmental domain, attitude extremity, and reactions to fracking. So this one's quite interesting. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so this was a kind of, this paper followed up on the first paper that we did on belief superiority, which is people's beliefs that their own opinions are more objectively correct than other people's. So we ask people about their attitudes on any given topic, and then we say, how much more correct is your view on this topic than other views on this topic? And people can say my view is no more valid than anyone else's, to my view is objectively correct, it's the only correct view. We've measured this in different ways. Sometimes we like literally ask people, how superior is your belief than other beliefs on this topic, or how much better. It doesn't matter the wording. We get this, those things are correlated like 0.95. But anyway, so that belief superiority measure, that like self-reported, like my belief is better than other people's, is what we're looking at when we talk about belief superiority. And it turns out that that is highly related to how extreme people's view is on a given topic. So the direction of their attitude doesn't seem to matter. So if you're thinking along the political spectrum on a topic, whether it's left or right on average doesn't really matter, but whether it's towards the middle or the more extreme views matters a lot. So the more extreme your view is on any given topic, the more superior you tend to feel about that topic. That's true for politics. It's true for environmental attitudes, as I'll talk about for this paper, but it's also true for everything else. So it's true for like which way the toilet paper should be rolled, or whether Coke is better than Pepsi, or things like that. It doesn't seem to be one particular domain. And in fact, we find that there are some people who report feeling superior about their beliefs across domains. When we measure those people in romantic couples, they tend to have less satisfying relationships, and their partners have less satisfying relationships, as you might imagine. But for this particular paper, we were interested in how this might play out with how people take in information about topics that they care about. And so for this, this was in 2014, so fracking was being hotly debated at the time, and so that's why we chose fracking as the topic. This was a study that we did in North Carolina, which at the time, the legislature was like hotly debated whether they were going to allow fracking to take place in the state. As it turns out, there's like not enough shale there for it to be economically viable. So it was kind of a non-issue anyway, but it was being like, there was very angry town halls happening and signs, both pro and anti fracking happening around the state. And so we thought this would be something where we could get a range of views. And so what we did is we asked people about their beliefs on a number of environmental topics, so climate change and fracking, among others. And then we did an experiment where we gave people short mock news articles or mock op-ed articles
Mhm.
for them to read. And these articles there's two versions of it that were almost exactly the same. We just changed a few keywords or phrases to make them either pro or anti-fracking. Everything else, the author name, everything was the same. And we had them read these articles and then respond to like what they thought about the article, the author, and about their own beliefs. And what we found is that for people who were low in belief superiority, so they might have had opinions, but they didn't think that their opinion was any more valid than others, they tended to get a little bit more uncertain about their beliefs on climate change or on fracking after reading the article. Like I think reading the article made them realize like maybe this issue is more complex. I don't know that much about it. And so they felt a little bit less certain. But for people who started out feeling that their view was really superior in either direction, they became even more certain about their belief after having read the article. And importantly, it didn't matter if that article agreed with them or disagreed with them. So no matter what they got, they came out thinking that they were superior. So they were finding either something in the article that agreed with them, that they were like, yes, this is true, or something that the article disagreed with them, and they thought, clearly this person who wrote this is an idiot. And they felt more certain afterwards. And we also looked at what they thought of the author of the article, and it turns out that they rated that person as more warm and more competent if they agreed with their position than if they disagreed. For people who are
Of
high in
course.
superiority. Yeah.
Now, did you actually check to see whether there really were expertise? I mean, I could imagine people that go to a town hall who might be environmentalists, maybe really truly studied up on something, or a geological engineer who does fracking. I don't know. You know,
Yeah.
they could have the spectrum there. Did that play into this at all, or is it just averaged out and assumed everyone just sort of has a moderate understanding?
Yeah, so for this one, we just assumed it was on average, like people were randomly assigned to conditions, and so expertise should hopefully have gotten, equal in both. For another paper that I did with a student here at Michigan, we looked at the relationship between belief superiority and perceived and actual knowledge.
Oh,
And
okay.
so we looked at on political beliefs. We gave people real tests on like how much do you know about this political topic, and compared that to how they had self-rated their knowledge compared to other people and their belief superiority. And what we found is that belief superiority is highly related to how much people think they know on a given topic, but is totally unrelated to how much they actually know. So the people who are the most feel the most superior are the most likely to overestimate their
Well, this
knowledge on
sounds
a topic.
almost exactly like Dunning-Kruger effect. And
It's
for
very
people who don't know
similar.
Dunning-Kruger effect, it's the Cornell professor, I think, came up with it. But it just basically says people who are, I'll say the short way, people who are stupid don't know they're stupid because they're stupid. And actually, there's a corollary where really smart people know something so well they think it's easy because it's easy for them and they don't realize how hard it is for others. But how does your work relate to Dunning-Kruger?
It's super related. I am very proud to say that David Dunning is actually now at the University of Michigan, so we can
All
claim
right,
him
there you go.
here. So yes, it's very related. So we didn't find that people who were the least knowledgeable were. So that finding is about like people who are the most unskilled are also the most unaware of it. And
Right.
ours was
It's a
looking at
little
this
different.
collection between belief superiority and knowledge, but it's like very, very closely related phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah, Dunning-Kruger is really interesting. And of course, you run across it every day, especially when you're doing climate communication, by the way. So that I do suggest that everyone check that out. Let's move on here to 1 second. Okay, your next, you've done a lot of research, by the way, a lot of papers to go over here. Effects of communicating the rise of climate migration, right?
Mhm.
Migration on public perceptions of climate change and migration. Okay, so what's this one all about?
Yeah, so this is a relatively new area of research for me with some colleagues here at Michigan and elsewhere. And what we were curious about was there's this increased coverage of the idea, like news coverage of the idea that people are going to have to move because of climate change, that a lot of people are living in places that are not going to be viable places to live forever, and especially due to climate change. And so we were curious, we were seeing these, like, the New York Times Magazine and others doing major exposés about this. And we were thinking that, I don't know what was behind the journalist heads doing this, but I suspected sometimes they're trying to communicate about this as like, this is a problem with climate change, and so we need to do something about climate change. And we were reading these as psychologists thinking, I'm not sure that that's going to be the takeaway that people get from these articles. We worried that what would happen
Build a wall.
Exactly. And so we decided to test this empirically. And so we've done a number of these kind of studies now, looking at if we talk to, and this is with US samples. So if we talk to Americans about the idea that people will have to move due to climate change, what does that do to their beliefs about climate change, their support for climate policies, and also their views on migration, either immigration, like people moving here from other countries, or domestic migration, people moving within the US because of climate change. And what we found is, unfortunately, what we had kind of suspected, which is that talking about climate migration, either reading news articles or hearing a podcast clip or whatever, seems to do nothing to change people's views on climate change or support for climate policies, like mitigation policies. Where it does seem to move the dial is to make people more concerned about immigrants or domestic migrants moving, to think that it's more risky to have migration, and to be wary of migrants moving to their area. It seems to be, as you might expect, there's huge political party differences that drive a lot of these effects. So the policy support doesn't move a lot because people are kind of tied to political party affiliation, but the kind of risk perception measures move a bit. We also see that, as you might expect, that people are less threatened by domestic migration than they are like cross-border migration, but they still don't love the idea of Americans moving to their towns either. So in this study, we particularly looked at, in some of these studies, we've done like nationally representative samples of like all of the US. In others, we've done studies that just looked at people in the Midwest to see if people in like kind of Midwest Great Lakes regions would react, how they would react, because there's a lot of discussion about how the Great Lakes area
that's
is
where that's where everyone's going to go.
Exactly. And, sitting here in Ann Arbor, maybe that'll be good for my property value. But so we were curious, like, how they would take this news, and they also didn't love the idea of Americans moving to be closer to them.
Did you try, though? I mean, there's another way of talking about the same subject, and that is to discuss how you are going to have to move, how you are going to lose your home, how you are maybe, like, I have already lost my house insurance where I live in California, and had to switch to the government insurance. And that's only going to last about a certain amount of time, by the way. Same thing's happening in Florida. So people in Florida, whether they're aware of it or not, they're moving out of Florida. They think their costs are going up, maybe in general, but it's really because of climate. So did you try framing it personally as they're the ones going to move, rather opposed to people moving near them?
Not yet, not in these studies, but stay tuned.
So that one would be obviously far more maybe effective in terms of getting people concerned, right?
Yes, I think it's a different question about like, is the issue like thinking about receiving communities that are likely going to have to take in people, or are you talking about like people who might have to move themselves? And like, some people are going to fit in both of those categories. So we were focused on like how the receiving communities might react, and I think that's important to know because they may not get a welcome reception. And those communities have to adapt. Like Ann Arbor is actually doing a lot on adaptation with the expectation that there's going to be people moving here in the future because of it. So so I think I take your point. We are talking about some work to look at whether, in particular, insurance information might alter people's views of particular places to live or climate change itself.
Well, I mean, I think this brings up maybe a bigger issue, and that is that people view climate change as something that happens far away, like polar bears are affected by climate change. and people in Africa are affected by climate change, but I'm not affected by climate. Everyone noticed the weather is different and things like that. But
Yeah.
there was this kind of a meme thing going around that says, you see now on the news, like on Twitter, for example, like almost every day, cars floating down or some town getting flooded. And someone said, it's you watch other people filming this until you're the one filming it.
Yeah.
And that idea that it's coming to get you, and it is, by the way. I mean, there's no question that you just wait another 10 years and climate's going to be impacting essentially everyone to some degree, and then 20 years like to a large degree. So how do we reframe climate as something far away and distant and something that happens to others, and into something that, if not personally you, then your children will be personally impacted in a negative way? That you would think, and by the way, I'd like you to do the study because I'm not sure this is true. You would think that would get people more motivated, but then again, maybe not.
Yes. Well, I don't have to do that study because somebody else already has. So I'm happy to talk about that. So this issue of there's a paper that I assigned to my students called Spatial Optimism and Temporal Pessimism. So people think that climate change is going to happen, happens to other people far away. So they're spatially optimistic, but it's going to get worse in the future, temporally pessimistic. So like, how can we bring it closer and make it feel like something that's concrete affecting you now? One of the ways to do that is exactly what you said, talking about legacy concerns, talking about future generations. I forgot that I did a study on this, but other people have done it. Like I said, there's a lot of papers. Basically, what we find is that when we talk about climate change as like something that will affect future generations, and that and draw some connection between people and those future generations, then it makes people more concerned about climate change and more willing to do something about it. So in one experiment that I did, we gave people information framed as like, there's a lot of data about everybody being collected all the time. And so in one condition, we told them, future generations will be able to learn what you did. And so your data, your action on climate change will be, searchable. Versus a condition where we made it seem like there's a lot of data out there. Nobody will ever be able to wade through it all. You're a needle in the haystack. You're more private. and it changed people's action on climate change. So if people thought like, like I am going to be judged by my actions in the future, then they were more supportive on taking action. Other research has actually, I think, is even more interesting than my own. There's some research that a team did with some climate advocates going to congressional offices and meeting with aides and using different kind of framings. And what they found was that legacy focused framing was like the most effective for getting congressional aides to be enthusiastic about this issue. Partly because you can imagine that politicians' actions are like, to the extent that any of us are anonymous, politicians are not. And so their actions actually very much will be known to future generations.
Right. But it's also a little bit back to the BP thing, where if you think that you're driving the car is what caused the storm of the century or something, that's one thing. But it's really it's our failure to demand action of policy to change the course of things. And no one, I mean, we're going to get to that later. I have some questions on that as well, like to the big picture things of why we're not really demanding action. But okay, wow, there's so much, again, absolutely so much to talk about here. So let's now we're going to get into some climate solutions. Hold on, I've got to replace. And so this one, now we're getting into climate solutions, public perceptions of geoengineering. I assume, by the way, you mean solar geoengineering, or does this also include carbon removal as part of geoengineering?
So in this review, I was talking about both solar geoengineering, carbon removal, and I've done work on perceptions of both of those.
And actually, the next one we'll talk about is the current paper. So
yes.
So tell us about what you learned about public perceptions of geoengineering.
Yeah, so this paper was a review paper, just trying to sum up like what is the research, the kind of state of the research thus far that has been done on what the public thinks about geoengineering. And the first answer is that the public does not think about geoengineering 80% of people have never heard of it.
Right.
And so that I think is really important to think about when we're considering how the public reacts, is that like this is very new to people, and we're kind of working as communicators or potential communicators. This is a blank slate where the initial framings are going to make a big impact on what people believe. This is not like climate change itself where everybody has an opinion already. This is something new that people have kind of, they're evolving and emerging opinions on. The research suggests that people are more wary of solar geoengineering than carbon removal. And there's variation within those categories as well. They tend to be, like I was talking about before with the naturalness idea, people are much more supportive of approaches that they see as natural than those they see as unnatural. So this comes up less with solar geoengineering, but with carbon removal, there's
nature-based solutions, right?
Nature-based solutions. They like better than direct air capture kind of approaches. I think a really key insight into this, and I will mention this again when you talk about the next paper, is that all the research up to this point is really hypothetical. So there is some carbon removal going on already. I'm not sure that people recognize or realize that it's going on or recognize what it's doing. Certainly with solar geoengineering, this is very abstract and hypothetical. So the things that matter kind of psychologically in terms of predicting support are likely to be very different in a world where this stuff is actually being deployed than in the current world where this is still kind of thinking about this in the abstract. I think once this stuff gets actually deployed, then people are the kind of how economic concerns of how might this affect my livelihood, or is this place going to be located near me or not, are going to be much more important than kind of psychological ideas about tampering with nature and stuff like that.
Okay. And so one thing I don't understand, and maybe you can help explain this to me, talking about the dangers of, let's talk about solar geoengineering now. There's a solar geoengineering, without talking about what happens if you don't do it, is to me like talking about chemotherapy without talking about cancer. Like if you just talked about chemotherapy and not in the context of curing someone of cancer, it would sound horrible. You're going to get poison to somebody. They're going to lose their hair. You're going to make them nauseous. You're going to almost kill them. And people would think you've lost your mind if you're proposing chemotherapy. But when you explain, by the way, if you don't do it, the person's going to die. Oh, everything changes, right? And then, please give it to me then.
Yeah.
To me, it's exactly the same thing. Yet so much of the resistance to geoengineering really just focuses on some of these side effects, which, there are negative side effects, but they pale in comparison to the side effects of not doing it. Why? So why is that? What's going on here? Why? And these are knowledgeable people, right? These are not the 80%. These are the 2% that have decided to study it, and yet they're still able to put out of their mind what happens if they don't implement the geoengineering.
Yeah. So I'll say the caveat that I have only studied the general public, so I have not studied experts. I think that and I'm also not a climate scientist, so the other folks that you've interviewed on this, who are illustrious and very smart people, are going to be able to speak to this much better than I can. But my sense is that there's a lot of uncertainty. It's new, and there's a lot of uncertainty and about solar geoengineering in particular, and that makes people nervous because we've seen where the side effects of unintended side effects of other actions, including fossil fuels, have taken us. And so I think that's what people are worried about, is the kind of unknown unknowns. I think for the lay public, there's that disconnect between maybe not feeling like climate change is real and then adding this new scary thing makes for a combination that makes people really concerned. With solar geoengineering, there's this whole other, this is changing minute to minute. It used to be 10 years ago that the concern about solar geoengineering that was brought up, or carbon removal, it was about moral hazards. That if you talked about technologies, it would undermine support for emission reductions, because people would think this was a technology silver bullet, and that this would be particularly true among political conservatives who tend to not be supportive of these policies in the first place. And there's some work that, including my own, that suggests that that can happen under certain conditions. Now what we're seeing is this, like in the US, all of these states banning solar geoengineering because based on kind of conspiracy theories about chemtrails. That
Chemtrails,
is,
exactly.
and that is like, so it's flipping the politics of this. And so I don't know where this is going to go. I've given up trying to predict this, but I think that is going to really change the story on like both general public opinion, but also how experts react to it as well.
Well, I can tell you my prediction is I guarantee we're going to do it, and it'll be opposition until the moment that we do it, because eventually we're going to hit, things are going to get so bad from climate change. And then people are going to realize at that moment that you can do all of the emissions reduction you want, all the carbon removal you want. You won't even notice you did it for decades, and it will be slightly better then. But it won't help you now, right? Everything that's happening and the collapse and famines and things, and you'll realize the only tool you have in your toolbox that acts immediately is solar geoengineering. There isn't anything else that acts within literally months of you doing it. There's other questions, like of course we're doing solar geoengineering on a massive scale today. We're releasing sulfur dioxide, around 70 million tons, down from about 100 million tons every single year. And we're releasing it from coal plants and ships and all that kind of stuff. And we're cooling the Earth by like 1/2 to 1 degree. So not a small amount. Another way of putting it, if we didn't do this, and it's purposeful, it's not for the purpose of cooling the Earth, but we are purposely putting sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, we would already be over 2 degrees of warming today without this. And yet that solar geoengineering is not considered solar geoengineering because we didn't do it with the intent of cooling the Earth, even though now that we're reducing ship emissions, as we've covered a lot on this program, that caused the spike in temperatures. So we're feeling the effects of reducing that solar geoengineering. Any thoughts on this? It gets back to the same thing where you do one thing over here and we don't even think about it, and yet we talk about maybe doing something over here, and then everyone gets all excited. And this is something that there's something psychologically going on here where we're able to ignore what we're doing now and just worry about small changes in the future.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me a lot of a psychological idea called the spotlight effect, that like what we're focused on any given moment is going to affect our decisions. So like it's the same thing that pops up. Like if I ask you how satisfied you are with your life, if you see bumps in life satisfaction, like when people are about to get married or about to have a baby, because that's what they're thinking about. But if you ask them like 5 years later how their life satisfaction is, it seems like it's gone down. And it's not that they're unhappy in their marriage or they didn't want the baby. It's just that like those are old news at that point, and it's not the spotlight of what they're focused on. And so I think it's very similar here. Like if you're focusing on this thing and it seems new and scary, then yes, they're going to react like, I don't like this new scary thing. But if you're asking them about things that have already been around, they're just like not top of mind because they have been around. And so they're kind of baked into what seems normal. And so I think that's part of at least driving these effects.
By the way, we're taking longer than I thought because we have so much we're covering here. Let's go to the last of the articles here. And this is a new paper, just came out or is coming out right now. It says accepted manuscript. Models and scenarios for solar radiation modification need to include human perceptions of risk. So what's this all about? And you also did this with Danielle Visioni, who was a guest on our program, and then there's some other folks as well.
Yeah. So what we were trying to do here is argue that there's increasing consideration of solar geoengineering and trying. Daniele's work and others have like tried to integrate. What would happen if you add solar geoengineering into existing climate models, and what would that do for the climate? What we're arguing is that those models also need to think about the people, that there are, turns out, people that live on this planet, and they are going to affect whether and how solar geoengineering might happen. And so when you start throwing people into these models, things get really complicated. And it can make it go in ways that don't seem rational from a climate perspective. So, people can decide whether or not to allow research. You might have bills, for example, banning at the state level or federal level solar geoengineering research to be done. And that would affect, how long it takes for solar geoengineering to be put online, or if it is at all. You might have, one of the things about solar geoengineering is that, like, once it is deployed, people don't know how to tell the difference between an effect that's caused by solar geoengineering and an effect that's caused by climate change itself. So if there's a drought, is that because of climate change, or is that because, or the underlying greenhouse gas emissions, or is that because of the solar geoengineering? And so if it's this new scary thing that's being implemented, it's very probable that if there was a drought that popped up, people might say, oh, it's that new scary thing, rather than the underlying, climate change that's been happening. And so the attributions that people make might affect, whether people want to keep doing solar geoengineering if it were to be started, or even if it were to be tested out in small batches, whether they would see effects and then want to take it back because of that. And that's going to, be affected by media perceptions of these things, and this like interplay between how humans perceive these risks and the climate system is complicated and needs people. Basically, the argument was just that we need to include the people in the models, because it is going to affect how these things happen and add a whole new range of uncertainties about what this could look like.
So I did a whole program on the trolley problem, which
Okay.
is, people would much rather allow 1,000 people to die than to be sort of directly associated with allowing 10 people to die. It was throwing the switch on a trolley that would save 1,000 people, but it sent it down a track that kills 10 people. But since you threw the switch, you would be responsible for the 10 people. It sounds like this is very much like that. I mean, obviously you could frame, you could only focus on the impacts of and you are in the discussion here, on maybe this drought, yet there's 1,000 other things happening on Earth due to high temperatures that aren't being talked about at the same moment, even though that's what you're trying to actually address. So did you look at the trolley problem? It kind of sounds like it's embedded in the research that you did, that people feel far more responsible for a particular action as opposed to allowing the current situation to have incredible damage.
Yeah, so we didn't look at trolley problem in particular, but I think it's certainly related. Like this, like are people focused on the action that's being taken by humans, or the inaction, or I guess they're both actions. It's the actions of spewing carbon versus the actions of geoengineering. We didn't look at that, but it's certainly related to these ideas of like what people are willing to do. As a just total aside anecdote, my favorite version of the trolley problem is a psych professor who asked its 2-year-old to do the trolley problem and explained it, and the 2-year-old just like rammed all the trains purposely and gleefully.
Yeah. So
maybe we need a 2-year-old.
So we covered, by the way, everyone, again, remember that links to all of these papers are in the video description, so you can see those. And I have so many questions for you that are sort of the bigger picture side. So let me start off with, we discuss a lot, and it's all embedded, I think, in what you're doing, hope versus fear, and in terms of climate messaging. What does your research show about fear as a motivator?
So I'll be talking not about my own research here, but some other folks' research. It's complicated to use fear as a motivator. The research that's out there suggests that small amounts of fear can be attention grabbing, and therefore get people to pay attention to this issue more than they otherwise would. But if you scare people too much, they like tip over into inaction and kind of just like want to curl up in the fetal position, or deny that this is a problem because it's too scary, like existentially. And so, and it may depend on who your audience is for where they are. So if somebody's already very concerned about climate change, then scaring them more is probably not going to be effective, because it might push them further along that path towards being overwhelmed. So I tend not to promote using fear. I think it also seems like it might be unhelpful for the spillover concerns that I was talking about. But
It
if we're
does
going
seem
to
to
do,
work. Conservatives seem to use it almost exclusively. The migrants are going to take your job. These policies will take away your SUV. You won't be able to have your stove, your gas stove, on and on. I mean, everything. It's
yeah,
almost 100% fear, and it seems to work quite well. It gets people elected.
it
Gets
works if,
policies put in place.
yeah. So fear can be motivating if you have a very simple action that people can take after they've been scared. So it's
Vote.
helpful for like voting. So that can be helpful for that. And if it's not something that feels truly existential.
So but kind of on the same subject, but a little different. So the desire for, I know there are studies, Yale Climate 360 and whatever, show that the desire for climate action is very high. I think at like 60, 70% is in that range. Yet no one's voting on climate. So there's like high general interest, but not really specific interest. I'm not sure what the right terminology is for that. But why is that? What's going on there that everyone says, yeah, I'd like to do something, but when it really push comes to shove, they're not doing anything, and they're not voting, and they're not really pushing it.
Yep, I think that has to do with the mismatch that you see between when you ask people about support for a particular issue versus ask them to rank order their priorities. And what you tend to see is that people are supportive of, like, I like a lot of things. I want a lot of things to be done. But if I really have to make a call for which things are most important to me next week, you see climate drop down the list. So
Right.
it's not at the top. And so those other things will tend to carry the day for voting. So I think that's why you see that mismatch. But I also think that there is with this thing called pluralistic ignorance. So people don't recognize that other people care as much as they do about climate change, and that other people are as supportive as they are about policies. And so they don't engage in the kind of collective action that they could, because they don't see as many allies out there as there actually are, including like political allies. And so I think that there's a some more publicizing of how much people are concerned and supportive of various policies would be helpful in terms of getting people to be willing to engage in collective action, and like reach out to community members about that.
Okay, so well, that leads to the question of what will it take to get people to demand real action on climate change?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think there's three things, broad buckets of things. The first is like information that they can actually use. So having consistent information about climate change and its effects in ways that they can actually digest. A lot of climate science is really hard for the average person to understand. So translating that into like how this is going to affect the things and people that you care about in kind of concrete ways, I think is key. And there's a lot of that work already being done. I don't want to dismiss that. But more of that is helpful. Having persuasion by people who they care about for things that they care about. So, that can be economic motivation in terms of like subsidies and stuff, but also, having trusted messengers talking about it in terms of in their own communities is really key. Talking about it in ways that align with people's values and ideologies. And so that's going to be different strategies for different audiences. And then the last thing is persistence. It's really easy for people to either like try and do one thing and feel like they're off the hook, or get overwhelmed and kind of burn out. And so having ways to tie in, like to help people get this on the long haul, is going to be really key. So like how can we, like my paper on how we can turn individual action into support for policies and things like that, I think is really important. How can we turn these into like life-changing, ongoing behavior and, collective action changes is key.
So kind of related to that is that we just did a program on how we're at 1.5 degrees Celsius right now, and we'll be hitting 2 degrees in the 2030s. And what people don't realize, we'll be hitting 3 degrees around 2050, not 2100, which is how it's normally discussed. That's just based on the recent acceleration that we've seen, and the 15-year trends and things like that. Is there a way to frame that so that the public actually starts to pay attention to what's really happening in a very short term? This is pretty amazing how short term that is. And again, 3 degrees, I think, to 80% of the population won't mean anything whatsoever, even though it's like collapse of civilization kind of numbers.
Yeah.
So any suggestions on that? I mean, it's kind of like the last question, I guess, in a way. But
Yeah, I think people don't know what 3 degrees is. I mean, Americans don't understand. It's not in
see,
Fahrenheit, certainly, so it doesn't help things. But I think translating that into like what this means in terms of like what this will look like in your community.
Oh.
So the visuals, this is what the streets are going to look like in your community with X amount of sea level rise, or this is what the number of wildfire days you can expect smoke in your area with this. I think that's the kind of translation that we need to make it powerful to people.
Okay. And you mentioned, well, I guess you mentioned this one, who should be informing us? You said trusted members of the community. So just before I get to my very last question, why do you think the media has failed to inform us adequately on climate change?
I mean, I think there's a
From a
lot
psychological point of view. I mean, I think it's a psychological
psychologically.
question. No, I think it is a psychological question.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, I think there's lots of non-psychological answers as well about the,
Who
norms
owns?
about, yeah, who owns what, and norms about both sidesism and balanced coverage. I think there's also like they don't want to be seen as crazy. Like if you like kind of I think of Don't Look Up and the kind of portrayal of what it would look like if climate scientists or other scientists, got on TV and started like, saying like the sky is
Yeah.
falling, we need to do something. Like people are, if they are not already aware of what's going on, see that as like outlandish and don't listen. And so I think that there's some degree of the media shying away from that because they want to be seen as credible, and they fear that they might not be seen as credible.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of it is also about that difference between like what people feel in the here and now versus long term. So I think up to this point, a lot of people in the media have not been focusing on it because their audience wants information about the things going on in their lives now, and they don't necessarily see that as being relevant to their lives. And so they're focused on like, the current political debate rather than what might happen in X number of years. I think they're also reflecting like what politicians are talking about, and politicians are not talking about things that won't happen when they're no longer in office.
That's true. That's true. So what are you working on now? What new research can we expect from you?
Yeah, so I am going back to the aversion to tampering with nature idea. I'm working on some work with this colleague who looks at not just kind of views on technologies, but anti-establishment orientation. So people's kind of distrust of elite institutions, various kinds of elite institutions, and looking at how certain forms of concern about tampering with nature might also predict distrust of institutions in general. So that is one paper I'm working on. Basically, if you're thinking about specifically technology tampering with nature or scientists tampering with nature, those kind of concerns, rather than just humankind, predict a lot of kind of anti-science and anti-society beliefs. And I have another new grant looking at how people communicate about solar geoengineering. So which analogies are used to describe solar geoengineering and how they are helpful or not helpful in getting the public to understand the nature of what solar geoengineering is and kind of other implications. So we're hoping to study both what scientists think of these various analogies in terms of their accuracy and what they convey, but also look at how using these analogies affects beliefs among the public and among policymakers. Oops, I lost the audio there, sorry.
Sorry, that was me on mute. Sorry.
Okay.
That was my fault. My fault.
Okay.
I said maybe I can help you with that since I've done every analogy there is
Yes,
with solar geoengineering. So we'll talk later about that.
Yes, please. We are in the process of collecting analogies now, so I'll take them.
So I want to invite Stacy, our co-mod here, and she has her own question, as well as questions from the YouTube chat, which I just looking at see there's quite a few of those. So yeah. Welcome, Stacy.
Hey, excuse me. Thank you. Thanks for being here, Kaitlin. I'm a former marketing researcher. I used my powers for not probably good. And so I left it. And but I'm so curious because apparently I am an extremist and I have belief superiority when it comes to climate. But somebody in the chat actually mentioned it's not belief, the thermometer that's not a belief,
Yeah.
like when you're reading things. So how would you classify people like Dan and Eli, myself, and most of the people who are watching this right now?
Yeah, so what I would say is that, so we measure people's perceptions of climate change and concerns about climate change, and we look, if you Dan mentioned the Yale climate group, where they have people on a continuum from dismissive to alarmed. So the dismissive people are probably going to feel that their beliefs are very superior, but so are the people who are alarmed. And what my research on knowledge would say is that where they are on that spectrum gives no insight into whether they're right or not. Right? So the people on either end of that spectrum are both going to think that they are objectively correct, but they're not necessarily wrong. I happen to also be an extreme on that spectrum. I am very alarmed about climate change, and I feel very superior about that particular belief. But me knowing that in terms of the measures that I'm doing doesn't give me insight into whether that's accurate or not. I think it's accurate because it's based on the science. But other people who have different beliefs on climate change also feel very superior without necessarily the science backing them up on that. So,
and Neil deGrasse Tyson said, the good thing about science is that it's true whether you believe in it or not.
Right.
So there's always that aspect of it.
Even though we're typically on Sunday mornings, and I tend to call it church, this is not a religion. This is based on science.
So we have you had your question, and then we can do Eli, and then get to the YouTube questions.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to put in the suggestion box. Dan said asking about fossil fuel. I would also tack on domesticating animal livestock. What is so natural about that? We think like eating regular meat is fine, but I mean, even how much land have we given up? That used to be plains and all sorts of things that helped keep our earth stable, to grow food for us, and more food for animals and all the things we do. And one other thing I'd like to put in the suggestion box for a piece of research is I am so curious about following up in areas where disaster has struck. So, it's hard to go for the pre-analysis with the next place that's going to hit, but when it's hit, what do they feel? Follow up 6 months, a year, whatever, and track them over time and see how they change in terms of feeling about climate.
Although, Stacy, I have to tell you, we had George Marshall on the program a couple of times, and he went into Hurricane Sandy territory afterwards. He found that people were less inclined to talk about climate change after being hit by climate change than before. And that's a whole other discussion, but you can check out our discussion with George Marshall if you want to hear more about that.
We had a lot of good questions, but I want to ask Nadia's, if too much fear is going to demobilize people, does that mean people will just freeze en masse like deer in headlights in the face of global climate catastrophe?
I think it's possible. I think it may not look like deer freezing in headlights, but it may look like people ignoring the problem and focusing on things that seem less scary to focus on. So I think it's possible. I think at a certain, or waiting until it's just kind of taking actions that are grasping at whatever is at hand. I think when people are really overwhelmed, it's not always that they just freeze, it's that they will sometimes fight or will try and take whatever is closest at hand, and that may not be the thing that is the most effective or helpful for them to do. So I think there could be lots of different ways that could be not helpful, and I don't know which way it would look, but I think
flailing.
We
will flail.
Yes.
Let's bring Eli, or another co-mod, and he has a question, and then we'll go to the YouTube comments. Welcome, Eli.
Hi, can you hear Eli? Me? Can you hear me all right? I think I'm still backstage.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. And what's your question?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. No, we hear you, Eli.
You're on your live.
We hear you, Eli. You're on your live. Okay, thank you. So In Los Angeles here, we've adopted something that is kind of a crossover in terms of individual and individual action policy, and that is taking our kitchen waste and putting it in the garden waste bin, which actually it's small, but it's high impact for what it is. And I'm wondering if any of your research touches on whether engaging people in that way compulsorily or notionally compulsorily gets them to be more aware of climate or be positive or negative to future policies. That's the first question. The second question is translating perhaps we've seen in Poland just recently, where a country welcomes in a lot of refugees, but then that creates a backlash that creates or that brings in people into office who both oppose the immigration, but also will be bad about addressing the causes of that immigration. In Poland, we know what that is, but the same could be said of.
Oh, we just lost you. Yeah, but why did the first question?
We just lost you.
About,
The first question.
Well, you just cut out, Eli. So I'm going to turn you off because you're getting echo.
You just
on
cut out,
there
Eli.
too.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, because it's not working.
So,
but
yeah, so the first question, that is similar to some of the studies that have looked at that possibility of individual focused actions crowding out support for other broader policies. So some of the studies that have been done on that were based on kind of nudge style interventions that were policies targeting individual actions, similar to, it sounds like, the composting idea that Eli mentioned. So without the right framing, people might see that as like, oh, we're taking care of it. This particular policy is already taking care of the problem. And so I think in that situation, you'd also want to follow that up and show how that ties into other broader policies that we desperately need to support.
Yeah, and the other question generally was politicians that, use fear maybe on migrants, but then implement policies that's just going to make it far, far worse. Which
I think, I mean, not really eloquent ones. Like, yes, I see that happening, and it is terrifying. But I don't have particular insights on how to avoid that, other than making sure the public understands the connection between these issues.
And vote. So, Stacy, what other questions do we have from the chat? And
Reese had a number of good questions. He said, given that this sounds like a longitudinal analysis and the laws have become more punitive recently, is there a suppression of enthusiasm through government?
I suspect they were asking about the spillover studies when they said it was longitudinal. So usually those studies, it's looking at just 1 or 2 time points. So not a long-standing, I don't have a long-standing survey, although other people like the Yale group do, and I highly recommend checking those out. I don't have any data that would speak to whether there's suppression of enthusiasm through government, but I can say very confidently that public opinion follows political elite actions. People often will follow the guidance of elite. So if political leaders are talking about climate change and conveying like this is a real problem and people need to deal with it and we need to take policies to deal with it, then that will get a lot of people on board. If there's governments that are calling it a hoax and saying it's not a problem, or political parties who are making the science seem uncertain, then that will undermine public support for needed climate action.
Okay. And another one, any studies on people feeling locked into growth through business, status, etc., and a background drumbeat of most vulnerable hit first, so perverse incentive to go up the wealth ladder?
Yeah, I don't have research on this myself. I just anecdotally, it does seem like there's some effort by like high wealth folks to kind of beat the system by getting rich enough that they don't need to worry about climate change and they can go live in a bunker in New Zealand or Mars or something. But I haven't studied that like aspiration among the public.
But even it's funny, people saying, like the rich won't be affected. The rich may survive, but they're going to be affected if they have to pick up and move to New Zealand and all the things that made life worth living, the hum of the city or the lull of the countryside you knew, like that's gone.
Yeah.
The one thing that I was interested in is the incumbent status. So you were talking about people's thoughts on new technology. Here in California, we have CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, and that has worked to stop housing being built in urban areas where we need it, so that we don't sprawl. It keeps roads open to cars instead of closing them for pedestrians and cyclists because they define the environment as what has always been. Same thing with the incumbency of automotive versus traditional personally owned vehicles versus robo-taxis or shared cars or bikes and e-bike subsidies. I just wonder why are we so set on, well, this is normal, this is the way it's always been, and we can't look and try and give the new things, which might be more beneficial, some support.
Yeah, I think there's a phenomenon called the status quo bias, that we are very tied into the status quo and biased towards preserving it. And anything that goes against the status quo feels scary and uncertain, and the possibility of bad outcomes looms larger than the possibility of good outcomes. And even though we can recognize that there's good and bad in the current system, we seem to only think about the bad in alternates. And so I think once people see it and experience it and realize like, hey, this is actually much better and I enjoy it, then that is the new status quo. But the getting over that hurdle of status quo bias takes a fair amount of imagination on people's part and thinking through the possibilities.
Gee. So, Kaitlin, I want to thank you. This has been a totally fascinating discussion. Again, we cover climate science and solutions mostly on Climate Chat, but we also recognize that what you were talking to us about today is really kind of the most important thing in terms of taking our science and knowledge and solutions into action, which has been, it's all psychology and communication and all of those issues. So the work you're doing is so important, and thank you for sharing a lot of it with us today. And we look forward to seeing what you're up to in the future. And thanks to you for joining us on climate change. Sorry for going a little bit over the time we talked about, but I think everyone
it was
really
a great
enjoyed the
conversation.
discussion.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
And so let me remind everyone to please do your part. Something easy you can do. Here's a little action thing you can try out, is to like and subscribe and share this channel with others, so that we can spread the word on climate change and knowledge about climate change, so everyone can actually be a little smarter and feel a little more superior in their knowledge. So please do that, and we will see you next time, everyone, on our normal Sunday at 10 a.m. Pacific time slot coming up next. So thanks, and Kaitlin, thank you again. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.